Everyone, my name is Rose Guizan Villazor. I am the interim co-dean of Rutgers Law School here in Newark. It is so wonderful to see students in person in this classroom. I am thankful to all of you, and in particular to Professor Laura Cohen for organizing this event today, and to all the other individuals who helped to make this possible. What I'd like to do is just to express my extreme gratitude to Professor Henning for being here today. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and the Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law School. I'm also thankful to Eric Campbell, who is a creative entrepreneur, youth advocate, and formerly incarcerated young person, for joining us today in conversation, along with Karen Thompson of the ACLU of New Jersey. I would be remiss if I also did not once again say my deep thanks to Professor Laura Cohen, who is a distinguished clinical professor of law and the director of the Criminal and Youth Clinic. Let me now turn over the mic over to Professor Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean, and thank you to all of you for coming today. We are so thrilled both to have our students here in real life, it's so exciting, and also to welcome all of you who are here remotely joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this building stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples and their continuing presence in this homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora, and honor the Lenape and other indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, the elders who lived here before, those who remain today, and the generations to come. So I cannot even begin to tell you how thrilling it was to learn that Professor Kristin Henning, my friend, my colleague, and one of the people who I respect and revere and wish to emulate most in this world, had written this book. This book is has been a journey, I know, for Professor Henning. She will tell you about it, not just the journey of writing the book, but the journey of her 25 years of representing young people in the District of Columbia Juvenile Court, of hearing their stories, of speaking their voices, of speaking their truths, and trying to make sense of the inhumanity and the cruelty and the irrationality of the system that I think we can only ironically call the youth justice system. And so when I learned that the book had been published and that Chris was willing to come and visit with us today, I of course leapt at the chance to let her speak her wisdom to all of you. And we are so fortunate to have that wisdom multiplied by 3 in having Eric Campbell and Karen Thompson with us. This is going to be a remarkable conversation, and I just am on the edge of my seat waiting to hear it. So I'm going to turn it over to them in 1 second. I just want to acknowledge a couple of folks who have made all this possible. The first are our intrepid tech folks, Edgar Oniego and David Haran, who I don't think are here now, but were before, helping us set all this up. I'd like to, of course, thank the Dean once again, not just for being here today, but for all of her support of the Rutgers Criminal and Youth Justice Center and all of the academic centers here at the law school and everything else that goes on here. I'd like to thank Josephine Nagel and Habiba Johnson, who are here somewhere, who are the coordinator for our academic centers and the administrator for our CLE program. None of this would be possible without them. And I'd also like to thank the inaugural Michael J. Sullivan Defender Fellows, Sarah Simon, who is here in back, and Jalen Porter, who have just done remarkable work pulling all these programs together this year. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Karen Thompson. Thank you.
No pressure. It's really great to see people in the flesh. It's been a very long time of Zooming. So I appreciate this, and I hope that we'll hear from you at the end of this discussion and keep it going as far and as well as we can. So to start, I just want to say a little thing that I wrote to get us started. As a lawyer, the work of the ACLU is about closing the gap between the America that was promised to us and the America that is. Fundamentally, as lawyers, our work is about confronting the differential in the application of justice. This is a very important frame to keep in mind as we enter into this conversation this afternoon around the work of Chris Henning and Eric Campbell. James Baldwin stated many years ago, this very kind of beautiful and terrorizing sentiment. He said, "The people I am speaking of who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role that this chattel was playing in their lives was to say that he was not a man, because if he wasn't a man, then no crime had been committed against him." And this idea extends to what we are here today to discuss, namely the many ways in which Black children have been criminalized to justify the fact that, and I quote from Ms. Henning here, "We don't see Black children as children." Put simply, a question we must answer as attorneys and soon to be attorneys is what, as a nation, we will choose to entertain pretenses about, and what, as stewards of the law, we will use to justify those pretenses. And when I talk about pretenses, I mean this idea that the law is equally applied to all people and that it is always equitable to all people. I'm a lawyer because I believe in the law. I'm a lawyer because I believe it is a tool of progress, and the way that we use it in the United States is one of the most exemplary ways in the world. But we have the work of making it better. We have the work of striving towards a more perfect union. And that is what I think Ms. Henning's book is about. And I'm thrilled to talk about it with you. So I guess my first question to you to start is, can you talk to us about the historical arc? We have this book here, but how did we get here? How did we get to the places that you uncover?
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. And please feel free to call me Chris. And thank you to Dean and to Laura for bringing me here. What a beautiful way to start. First of all, with that James Baldwin quote, I mean, just nailed it and really sets the stage for that historical arc, right? So, I mean, the question is, why is there such a differential in the treatment of Black children in the system? And it originates absolutely from history. America has a long history of failing to see Black children as children. I mean, so from the era of slavery, when Black children were treated as the property of their purported master, through the civil rights era, when you can have an Emmett Till who's lynched at the age of 14. And why is he lynched? He's lynched for a symbolic purpose, right? To make the symbolic statement that America will not tolerate integration, right? And we move into the 80s and the 90s, and we see Black children exploited again, right? When politicians recognize that they can manipulate race and crime for political gain. So in order to justify those three distinct eras, right? Slavery, this, lynching, this brutal lynching of Emmett Till, and this super predator myth that is birthed about Black children out of the 80s and the 90s, then you have to demonize them. You have to dehumanize them, just as James Baldwin says, right? And so in order to justify those atrocities, you have to paint them, Black children, as a threat, right? As a threat to America, and in Emmett Till's case in particular, as a threat to white women. And so then you have this legacy, this narrative that is intentionally constructed that now lives today in the American psyche, in our subconscious, right? And so that even folks, we like to use the word woke, even folks who are woke, even folks who articulate and profess a commitment to democratic principles of racial equity still have fear of Black children. And we have to be honest with ourselves, every single one of us. That includes people within the same race and across races, right? If you walk through a park and you see a group of white children laughing, frolicking, even tussling with one another, are you afraid? But if you see a group of Black children in the city, in a park, are you afraid? Right? Doing the same exact behaviors. And the reality is, if we own it, we all have a little anxiety when we see Black children. And that's the legacy of that intentional narrative that's run throughout history.
I want to turn it over to you, Eric, because I don't want to spend our whole conversation being academic about things and keeping them here, but I really want to talk about what this means for us individually, day to day. So,
you know, the conversation and the acknowledgement of this dialogue, the importance of it, you know, it affects me to my day-to-day every day as I speak. My partner's here with me. I can't stress the amount of times I'm pulled over, and immediately in my psyche, I go into a guilt. Am I clean? What's going on? I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that I have no flaw, no error when I'm in the right already. So how in depth this conversation is, it's not just in the perspective of how the criminalization of Black youth are, it's how the effects and the trauma affect us already. And as a parent, the effects of it is transferred without, it's so subtle that the train of thought and action is passed on. And like I shared before, I was in a car, was pulled over, and my 5-year-old, she was 5 at the time, she's screaming to me in the backseat, Papa, 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 and I was, baby, let me deal with this. And he comes to the car and he runs my thing, and he walks off, takes my plate, my ID, and my daughter says to me, I won't let him take you. She's 5. She already associated danger with this encounter. And I haven't spoke to her about my experiences, but this is how in depth and rooted this topic, this discussion, this problem is, and it's easily overlooked.
So to that point, I'd love you to talk a little bit about how the psychology of people who have to go through the system in the ways that are so targeted, so specific, start to warp people's relationship, not only with the criminal justice system, but with their own relationship with their neighborhoods, with the question of surveillance, with the question of relationship to police generally.
Absolutely, and it's such an important point, this notion of how it's overlooked and misunderstood. But I talk about the ways in which Black children now are so, they live with a pervasive fear, right? Pervasive fear of being stopped by the police. They live, so many people, so many Black children live in neighborhoods that are overwhelmed by police. And I think people don't know that. And so, for example, there are children who literally wake up in the morning and there's a police car parked in the front. Police car parked on the street corner, police car at the gym, at the recreation center, right? And most of us take it for granted that we can walk through our neighborhoods and not only not see police, but certainly not be stopped by the police, right? Absent, since it's a law school, I can say the word, absent somewhat reasonable, articulable suspicion, right? That, there's a crime afoot. But Black children don't, they literally live with this constant notion that I can be pulled over even, as you said, if I'm doing everything right? And so there's this phenomena. So one of the things that was great about, writing this book is I had all those stories from my clients, and I tell those stories and, talk to young people about those stories, but understanding the psychology and doing the research and understanding there's actually a phenomena, there's a name for it. So one of the phenomena that I learned about was stereotype threat, which I didn't know about. Some people may have heard of it, but it's the idea of living every day with the fear that you are going to be portrayed as criminal solely because of your race, right? Imagine what that's like every single day. And then from there, the trauma that comes from that. And so there's now a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary trauma that Black and Latinx children, the studies have been done in both populations, but Black and Latinx children who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who have frequent stops and contacts with the police, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, hypervigilance, meaning simply that they're always on guard, not trusting the police, which is what you get at, the relationships, how it erodes relationships, right? So not trusting the police, and then that distrust of the police transfers over to other state actors, even teachers, right? And so students begin to not perform as well at school because they walk into school and they see the face of officers that look just like the officers that they saw in the community, right? So it's just an unending reality for them. And that is something that, when I go out and I talk about the book, people are surprised by it. They just had no idea that people live with that much contact with the police. And it absolutely distorts their relationship, right? So if you're told every single day that you're bad and that you're a criminal, what do? If you have any sense of self, you begin to resist those labels, right? You push back, you reject the label, but the rejection of the label doesn't sound like a reasoned, articulate argument to the police. Officer, I don't appreciate the way you're talking to me. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds like an impulsive, emotional outburst from an adolescent, because we know that's what adolescents do. And so you get this tension, this escalating tension between police officers and Black children today because of the deeply embedded biases that officers, and that really, quite frankly, all of us bring into the relationship with Black children.
And I think it's really interesting how you talk in your book about the literal psychology of being a teenager, right? Like it's a very specific thing. We know it. That's why we don't execute children, but that we don't allow, people under 21 to buy liquor. There are reasons why all of those things are in place, those strictures. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why that science of brain development is suddenly not present when we're talking about Black children, and maybe looping into talking about schools and
right. So this notion of adolescence, I mean, that's another area, so I knew, I've been representing kids for about 26 years. And so as a part of the work, you learned, I'm sure, if you're in any of Laura Cohen's classes, you certainly have learned about adolescent development as a part of the work that we do. So we know about the brain, but really, what I did not know before writing this book was that adolescence, this period of adolescence, is a social construct. So what in the world does that mean? That means we made it up, right? We made it up that before the Industrial Revolution, we saw development in two main phases, childhood and adulthood. And it wasn't until we get into the Industrial Revolution and we all needed greater skills, right? And so what happens is middle-class parents want their children to thrive in this industrial world. And so they say, okay, well, we're going to pull our kids out of the field and into classes, right? And so they had, that's when, mandatory education comes about in our country. We've got professional schools, colleges evolving. Well, guess what? Who gets to take advantage of that? White middle class, right? It wasn't never, adolescence wasn't seen at its origins as available to, Black and brown people at all. And so the privileges of adolescence are what's really critical in this conversation. And so while truly to this day, white children are allowed this advantage of extended periods of social and academic growth, the opportunity for adventure, experimentation, entertainment. They get the privilege of being in adolescence, which includes public safety, public affirmation. Black children for doing all the same things we know about in adolescence: impulsivity, sensation seeking, fairness fanatics. They love their friends and their peers. White children get the full advantage of that, while Black children are truly, they're expelled from school, stopped, frisked by the police, They are, when they enter the court system, they're treated like adults. This opportunity, this really important period of adolescent development is deprived or denied to Black children. And I'll just say one thing, you ask sort of why that is, and it is in large part about the implicit racial biases that we see. There's one fabulous study, there are many fabulous studies, but one in particular that talks about the ways in which we as a society, both police officers and civilians, look at a Black child and perceive them to be 4.5 years older than they actually are. Right? So you think about a Tamir Rice, who's just 12 years old, baby face. He's already perceived to be 16 or 17. But think about a 16-year-old who is every bit of an adolescent, every bit of a teenager is perceived to be an adult at 20, 21. And so we've got all of these biases that are undermining what it means to be adolescent.
Eric, I don't know.
So you spoke really in depth about the psyche, and coming up as a juvenile myself, in my case, they were using the development of the mind. And at the time of my case,
Just talk a little bit about your case, so everybody knows.
yeah, I was at the age of 15, I was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 7. It was a felony murder in which I didn't actually pull the trigger, but I was present during the robbery. And throughout my case, I was perceived and dealt with as an adult, regardless of my age, my situation, and even as we wrote into our appeals, the argument of factual scientific evidence of my development, it was almost that being in my place and my skin, my color, my circumstances, it was voided, it was excluded. And while incarcerated, I saw a difference in where our counterparts, our white counterparts with the same charges were coming in with the lesser sentences for the same charges that other people were getting in different regions. And, you try to maximize the curiosity of why, and you hear mitigating circumstance, you hear, but if you really dig deep into it, the separation of how Black youth are dealt with, it's almost like from birth, there is no acceptance of toddler, adult, adolescence. It's already a stigma of where you're going. And to go even further into the stigma and the development of many brothers like myself and my age, I remember in school, I forgot her name, Miss Belsky, because I couldn't read the book properly, she said to me, "You will be in prison washing dishes." This is a mindset. And when she said that, it stuck with me a long time that I possibly wasn't good enough to do that. Prison has always been a conversation since 3rd grade. So this is a lot of stuff that, and this is a small scale, there's many who face even grave and in-depth circumstances, but that shows the development of it. And on the other side of the spectrum, growing up in Brooklyn, especially through the 80s, during the crack epidemic, you got to see how the transition and the development of how we looked at police as an opposition, that rules as well, which feeds the continuation of how we're translated or discussed, or even looked at as peers, and then we develop the opposition of that, which grows us into what will be examples of criminal behavior, when it's really not, when it's an adjustment of your own psyche and your own development and the realm of where you feel your reach is. And I think that's not one, but it is a big issue with not only the criminalization in law, just in society itself. I remember the first time going into a convenience store and experiencing someone clenching their purse. And you know what I said at that time? I'm a flinch at heart. Because I was so angry. I want to give you something to react to. Because I was not thinking about you. You feed that. And now my behavior translates the exact same things that I'm being said to be, because I feel like I have no choice. feel like I have no options or no viewpoint to actually be or exist how I am. So you know what? That's how I'm gonna be. And then you grow up in that with no true dialogue.
Right.
Because, I can't even tell you how young I was when I first heard, we don't call the police. I grew up hearing that before my experiences of, oh, I get why we don't call the police. So, the criminalization starts in so many different aspects. Like it's a real, if we want to use the sense of a war from all angles when it comes to, the Black child, preferably men, but the Black child, period, and what you grow up and have to come out of and also exist in,
I think it does a lot of damage to relationships, and that's not something we talk about the system itself. We talk about the individual, but when we talk about the relationship of the individual to the system, this is exactly what makes it very hard for people to want to serve on juries, to want to vote, to, it goes the distrust of police, of everything, because you don't feel like you're a part of it or that it represents you. So as someone who was a public defender, I'd love to hear about what you saw in the courtrooms and how that affected your clients and how it affected you as a lawyer. And what you saw.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I really want to I'm going to come to this court question, but feeding off of what you're saying, you asked me in the hallway, she asked, how have people been receiving the book? And I would say overwhelmingly, people have received the book really well, but I get some hate emails, I get, hate Twitter tweets, you'll have to fix me, but hate tweets. And one of them was really on this point. I was on a little news show and I was making this point about basically the ways in which Black children begin to give back what's portrayed to them, right? Which is, you're bad, you're criminal, I'm gonna grab my purse, and then you flinch back because, look, I'm gonna give you what you got. And I was trying to explain that the ways in which we treat Black children has a profound impact on the ways in which Black children then begin to act. Okay. And somebody wrote me and said, well, that's just such a ridiculous argument. So now you're saying that it's the police officer's fault and it's the society's fault that Black children behave the way. Yeah, actually, that's exactly what I'm saying. And in fact, it's actually not that radical, right? Because we all know that the ways in which you are treated as a child has a profound impact upon the way you behave when you're an adult. Somebody tells you, you're not welcome here, you're not loved, you're not worthy, then you buy into it, right? Sort of the old, it sounds academic, the old labeling theory becomes, self-propelling, but it doesn't even have to be, self-fulfilling as much as it's also a form of protest. And this is the point I was making earlier. I'm resisting your label, right? So I'm gonna retaliate in some way. So there's so much, I just wanted to feed off of that. And then, you get to court, right? And it's like nobody has any understanding of any of this, right? They don't understand the trauma. They don't understand this notion of stereotype threat and why it is that there's so much tension between police and children of color. And instead, it's whatever the police says must be right. So the narrative that gets fed into the courthouse about Black children must be right, because we buy it and we believe it. And then as a result, because we see Black children as so much older and not as adolescents, we don't have the same empathy, we don't have the same grace, we don't have the same tolerance, we as a nation decided, right, that we wanted separate juvenile courts, right, for our children, take them out of prison, but yet when it's a Black child, no, you at the age of 15 are gonna be tried as an adult. Right, so we make exceptions. Who do we make exceptions for? We make exceptions for Black children, and particularly Black boys and Black men, over and over again. And I always like to weave in, because what I wanted to do with the book is to tell the stories. But for people who are like, okay, well, that's just an anecdote, that's just a one-off. Well, guess what? Here's the research to back it up. And so one of the most powerful stories and studies in that regard is a study that was done specifically about juvenile life without parole sentences. And all the participants in the study were given a fact pattern, right? And they were given a fact pattern, for any of you all know Graham versus Florida, right? Where the 17-year-old was accused of a brutal rape of an elderly woman. That's the fact pattern everybody is given. They are also given information about rehabilitative alternatives for children. And should we not have a more lenient approach or response to children who commit crimes? And that's sort of the question. That's the packet of materials they get. Guess what they do? They switch one word in the fact pattern for half of the people. Half the people believe that the fact pattern involved a white child. The other other half believe that it was a Black child. People who believe that it was a Black child, what do you think they said? Oh, no. You do the time, you do the crime, you need to do the time. You need to do the time. There's no leniency. When they thought it was a white child, as a matter of policy, they thought we should have more lenient approaches to children, right? So race matters, and that's really the takeaway. And so you see it in juvenile court, in youth court, as we're trying to call it. We see it in youth courts all over the place. Like, it's just the narrative from society is so deeply embedded in the court system that we lack the empathy to treat children like children, even in the court.
I'm thinking about Commonwealth v. Warren out of Massachusetts in 2016, where the Massachusetts Supreme Court decided that it was not unreasonable for any Black suspect who's being chased by the police to run away, that it wasn't an indicator of ill intent or criminal intent. It was just a sign of not trusting fear and recognizing fear. And I think, to your point about the courts, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the reasonable child standard and like if we can recreate or rethink what reasonableness is within the context of everything that we've already talked about.
Yeah, I love being in this law school space because we can throw out words like the reasonable child and reasonable articulable suspicion and what does that mean? And so, look, I say all the time, I do like a lot of trainings, litigation trainings for attorneys and other stakeholders in the system. And I ask them, okay, so who is the reasonable person, right? And we get that torts answer. So maybe some 1Ls in the room could give me, it's the one who possesses the intelligence, of a reasonable adult. But the reality is, we know that a reasonable person historically has been an adult white male who is at least reasonably well off. So people will say to me, well, Professor Henning, how could you possibly say such a thing? Well, that is because who has been writing the opinions, the Supreme Court opinions and the state high court opinions interpreting the reasonable person throughout criminal law? And historically, that has been a white adult male, reasonably well off and educated. That is the reasonable person in the law. But finally, right, we got some movement on that reasonable person with JDB versus North Carolina, right? Supreme Court case saying that age is relevant. Our wonderful Justice Sotomayor says age is relevant in that reasonable person analysis, at least for purposes of the Miranda question, right? Whether or not, a child can waive or whether or not a child is in custody for purposes of Miranda, all right? So now we have some give in that reasonable person. So what I have really been pushing, and what I think Commonwealth versus Warren out of Massachusetts does, is recognizing also that that doesn't go far enough. There's not only just a reasonable child, we also have to have a reasonable Black child. Right? And so what do all of these questions mean? Anytime where we see the question of reasonableness in the Fourth Amendment analysis or throughout criminal law, is it enough to say a reasonable child? And I've been pushing further, a lot of people have pushing further and saying we got to have a reasonable Black child, right? And the question that I ask you in a law school crowd is, look, anybody, right? Like, would a reasonable Black child, would any reasonable Black child feel free to walk away when the police walks up to them, right? And kindly says, can you lift your shirt? Can I search you? Would a reasonable Black child feel free? No, they wouldn't, not in today's society. And so we have to, if the Fourth Amendment, for example, right? That's just one of many doctrines. But if the Fourth Amendment is to mean anything at all, have any meaning and validity and power for Black children, then we have to acknowledge that, that the reasonable person has to account for race. And so that a Black child runs from the police, not because of consciousness of guilt, but because of fear, right?
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. So okay, fine, we'll have a reasonable Black child standard,
Right.
but then,
A Latinx child. And
right, exactly,
slope.
how many is that gonna be? Is there gonna be a reasonable Black girl standard? Is there gonna be, you know, someone with a mental illness standard?
Yeah.
How many? How does it work?
No, I think it's an excellent question. It's always that slippery slope question. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not afraid of it, right? Like, I think there is a historical legacy or historical reality that is really pretty much impossible to challenge. Just open the book, read the book, right? That, explains why certain demographic groups are less are more likely to be afraid or have a different reasonableness standard. So that's one answer, that if you force me into the box of the slippery slope, I will go there with you and pull apart, the different demographic groups. But I actually don't even think, for example, that we have to. I mean, think about what Justice Sotomayor did, right? She says, right, in her footnote, right, we don't have to talk about the science of adolescent development because just common sense, right? There are some things that are objectively known in society to be, and one of those things is children, right? And so as a whole class, right, we've got children who have a different standard. And it really, as she says, it's not that hard to do, right? Like, it's what is objectively and reasonably, known in society. I think other things there are just certain things like, I think about consent, right? Whether or not, I asked earlier whether a Black child could ever voluntarily consent to a search. My answer to that is no. I also think there's a legislative fix to that, right? Which is that we, as a country should decide and prohibit police officers from seeking consent from a child. And so that instead, a police officer can only approach a child if there is reasonable articulable suspicion, or I'd love to get rid of Terry versus Ohio and just have a probable cause standard, which we originated with, all right? So I'm asking for a lot now, but we can ask for it. So,
But there's levels, right?
Yeah.
Because even after the stop, if a child is taken to the station, then we're talking about how they're being interrogated.
yeah,
Right? And all of the other levels. So it's all building, it's all kind of, exploding from these initial touches.
Absolutely. And I mean, so you go to the interrogation. I also talk about that. There are a number of states that have been pushing for the prohibition of interrogation of young people without lawyers, right? Not without parents, because why parents, are afraid.
Yes, and that's a tag on that.
Yeah, please.
In my circumstances, I was interrogated without not only a lawyer, without my parent. And the fear of what I was gonna face, I would have done, and I did.
From your
anything-
parent, what you're facing?
No.
Oh, from the police.
From the police.
Yeah, sorry.
I did exactly anything that they said. And I signed anything without proper reading it. I made a video, anything they told me to do, I did in the fear of hearing, it's gonna be worse if you don't.
Right.
And not once was I asked, do you want to wait for a parent or a lawyer? And the information, again, was just based, and how my reaction was based on that great fear of I'm in the custody, I'm in the base, I'm in the home of the person that we don't talk to,
Right.
that does not like me. And here I am. I have to conduct under what they said. And I did everything.
And I love hearing your story because people watched, how many of y'all watch When They See Us, right? The Exonerated Five, and people think those are just one-offs, right? That was an extreme example, relegated to, the 90s. No, this stuff happens. That happens all the time and it still happens, right? And so I'm of the mindset, I'm curious what you think of this. I'm of the mindset that no child should be interrogated absent a lawyer, because when the parent shows up, the parent is just as afraid.
Yes.
The parent has all the things that they just taught you, and they're going to tell you confess too, which is what we saw in
Yes,
Exonerated.
and I agree. Most definitely a lawyer should be present during any of those, because it's a legal action, period.
Right.
So it should be some set guideline to that. And again, like you mentioned, the parent having that same fear that was passed down, that traditional trauma, it just fuels the actions to do what they say.
Right.
And when it comes to the law, a lot of the parents didn't understand. Like in my circumstances, even through my whole trial, I didn't understand my sentencing until I was upstate and was told my guideline ranges and what I wasn't. and what I was getting. So it's very important to have that from the beginning, because, you know, the odds of just is questionable.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Tariq? You have an anecdote about him, and I know that we've talked a little bit about the reasonable child, but I'm curious if you could just tell us that story. And
you know what I told you, I always have to remember. So I do.
Oh, right.
So all of the kids in the book that I talk about, I've given pseudonyms. And so I realize that I like sometimes forget which kid is which. So if you tell me which story.
Why are you running?
Oh, right. So the classic, oh my God. So, you know, so there's a story, one of our clients who I call Tariq, who is walking, he's at his home. It's like 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. He comes outside and he wants to go next door to see his relative who lives in the apartment next door. So he walks outside of his apartment. He gets to the end of the sidewalk and he makes a right. Just as he's turning the corner, he sees a police car with 2 officers sitting inside staring at him. So when he sees the officer, he has the slightest break in his step, literally what the officers call in their police report a stutter step. So it's like boom, boom, right? And so the officers then see the stutter step, they jump out of their car and they begin to follow him. He notices that they're following him, he begins to run. Right? Takes off running. He gets to the building next door. He grabs the door only to find that it's locked. So he jumps behind a bush and hides behind the bush. First of all, that's so adolescent, right? Magical thinking. Where did he think he was going, right? They saw you behind the bush. But when the police are, you know, right on top of him, they grab him and they say, "Why are you running? Why are you running?" He looks at them and he says, "Because you're chasing me." Right? It's such a classic example of what you see between Black children and police officers today. And it really, I mean, in every regard, layer for layer for layer, you know, lays out so many of the themes that we're talking about today and themes that are in the book. The first one being, why are they even staring at him in the first place? He's coming out of his apartment at 10 a.m. in the morning, like any, you know, the kid's a Saturday morning. He's not supposed to be in school. He's supposed to be out and about, right? But that they're staring at him. The second layer is the trauma, right? Why does he hesitate, right? Why does he hesitate? He hesitates because of the fear. He hesitates because of that stereotype threat. He's just certain, just like you said, I begin to look around. Do I have everything, right? Your mind it's like a cognitive overload, right? That's what the research calls this cognitive overload, because you begin to process, oh my God, there's an officer. He might be looking at me. What does this mean? What have I done? And you hesitate. Why do you hesitate? Because when you're in this cognitive overload, it depletes our capacity to do things that we take for granted, like walking, sitting, talking, right? So we hesitate in our step. What happens when you hesitate? You then look guilty. The officer presumes because I stutter steps, now I must be conscious, I must have some consciousness of guilt. So it's just such a profound, profound story, right? And then what does he do? He's an adolescent, he runs, right? He's not going anywhere. He's not getting away from these officers, but that magical thinking, and he runs, right? And then the officers don't understand it at all, right? And so it's just such a classic sort of scenario.
I could tag on that real quick. There was an incident when I was in high school, right before my arrest, where I was on a train and an officer walks into the car. So early on, you know, someone broke into the conductor's booth and they were making all kind of announcements. And he came on the card and he says, "You get off the stop." Get off the stop. And he said, "Yeah, everybody on the car was saying it was you." It was like 3 of us in the car. So I know for a fact it wasn't me. So of course he was lying. And I said, no, it wasn't me. And he says, "Calm down. Calm down." And I'm like, "I'm calm. Put your hands down." So now I'm nervous.
Yep.
And I'm angry because you saying they said it wasn't me. He actually made me kneel down on the platform. It was a rainy day. He made me kneel down on the platform. And he ran my name. I don't even think he ran my name. He just did the actions of, give me your ID, give me my school ID. And he said, "Get out of here. Go for a walk." And gladly it was my stop. But that moment stuck with me. And then months later, I'm in the park and there's a fight that has nothing to do with me. And cop cars pull up. And the first thing I do is bolt.
Absolutely.
And the crowd that bolted with me we all didn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
But the cop cars chased us.
Yep.
most of us got away, but in that action, we just had that fear and it took me back to every experience, every fear, every movie, everything I was taught. I don't want that trouble.
Right.
And I ran.
So deep. I wonder, I would never ask in the room for real, but like thinking about how much what we're just talking about is such a foreign reality. Just it's so foreign to so many people, never grown up in a community where you're afraid and everybody just takes off running every time they see the police, or stutter steps when you see the police, or is worried. It's a foreign, concept to so many people. And I just wanted to, I don't know, just listening to it I just wanted to name that.
What does that mean for people in neighborhoods?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean for your day, again, if you're just trying to live your life? What does that do to the child? What does it do to their family?
Yeah.
What does it do to the community?
Yeah. There's another story in the book that I tell that I think paints that answer, that gives that answer really, really clearly. And it's a client I represented named Kevin in a clinic. So I teach, as Laura said, I teach a clinic also. And probably it was about the year before we all looked, before the pandemic So we were in the office, and I will never forget sitting in my office and the phone rings, right? And one of my students, answers the phone, and I could hear, this whole conversation. And our client, Kevin, calls to say, hey, can you find out whether or not there's a warrant out for my arrest? And my student and I are like, well, this is wild. We were just in court the day before. Had there really been a warrant for your arrest, I guarantee you they would have picked you up. But he kept saying that. We could hear his mother in the background yelling, boy, you're just being paranoid. So we continue to ask him questions. What it turns out is that our client had been sitting in his living room, looking out the window, and he saw a police car, again, parked in front of his house. And he said the police car had been sitting there for 2 hours. Our client was convinced that the officers were sitting there waiting for him to come out, because when he came out, they were going to arrest him. Completely, I was going to say irrational, but it's actually just the opposite, right? So, but he's stuck with this fear. And I remember thinking in that moment, well, his mom isn't right. He's not paranoid. He's actually traumatized, right? His experiences with the police made that actually a rational conclusion. It would be irrational to any of us, right? To many of us. And in fact, I often tell people when I share that story, I said, for those of you who are thinking to yourself, well, if you weren't doing anything wrong, if you weren't committing any crimes, then you would never be worried about the police outside. And I said, well, that's true only if you don't grow up in a neighborhood where you see police officers 24 hours a day. And so this particular client, Kevin, I had been representing 3 years with 3 different, sets of students, and he had been stopped well over 50 times in his teenage life, right? And yes, it is true. I represented him, so obviously he did something. You know what he did? He was a weed dealer. He used marijuana. He sold marijuana. He got stopped far, far more times for doing nothing at all. Although he, of course, had been stopped for selling weed, but now he was completely paranoid around police officers. So that's what it does. You know what I mean? So you've got a kid who's traumatized, doesn't go outside, literally for 2 hours, afraid to go outside, right? Because he's afraid of the police. You've got mom who's worried. You've got this tension and anxiety in the household. And we saw it all the time, with them, because she thinks her son's paranoid. And, it's just so much for families to handle, right? And it's really complicated. The other thing final thing I'll say about it is, there are other stories in the book about the conflict, right? Because parents, you think about Black children or Black communities, Black leaders, Black mothers, Black neighbors, we all want to be safe, right? But we want to be safe, but we don't want to be safe at the expense of police officers coming in and terrorizing our children, right? And so the question becomes, do I not call the police, or do I call the police, right? Who do we rely on? Do we take matters in our own hands? And so there's conflict and tension in the Black community around, how to resolve that. And so I think that's one of the things that it just.
And I want to loop back to schooling, because
Yeah.
that was one of the statistics, try to think of myself as a moderately informed person. And then I'm reading these statistics, and 36% of elementary schools have police officers
Isn't it
stationed there. Why?
what purpose,
For what
right?
purpose?
Right.
For what purpose?
And the story of, the evolution of school resource officers is, such an amazing one. The real short version, that's another thing that I learned in writing the book. The very short version is I bought into the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools because of Columbine, right? And that teachers and parents were afraid to send their kids to school after the mass shooting in 1999. But if you go back and you do that research, actually, you see that the first police officers appeared in Indianapolis in 1939 when the early conversations or the early threat of integration, right? And then the numbers began to skyrocket in the civil rights era. Right. And particularly after Brown versus Board of Education. And you see all the iconic pictures of, police coming to the schools under the guise of facilitating integration, when in fact, what they were doing was, forming a barrier or preventing or impeding real integration. So that's the evolution of school resource officers. And guess what? School resource officers were so prevalent in schools that the National Association of School Resource Officers was founded in 1991, 8 years before Columbine. Most people don't realize, I didn't realize that, okay, until I did this. 8 years before Columbine. And then what happens to Columbine? After Columbine, yes, the federal government, yet again, increases funding for school resource officers, but where do those school resource officers go? They don't go to like the suburbs, the wealthy white suburbs where all the mass shootings were happening. They were sent to the urban schools. And so when you talk about 36% of elementary schools, it's 36% of elementary schools that serve a predominantly Black and brown population.
And with military grade weapons.
With military grade weapons.
Yes.
Isn't that insanity, right? And that's also, facts that people don't know. And it wasn't until Ferguson, right? After the killing of Mike Brown and, the city was taken over by this military grade, equipment as a way that it was in those protests that students out in Los Angeles, when they realized that they had actually received, that they were being policed by military grade equipment that was also being used to manage protests out in Ferguson. And so they, again, what I love about young people is their activism, and they were like, no more of this. And so they removed the military grade equipment from, that's one school, but they're elsewhere. It's elsewhere.
Yeah, very much. And, growing up, I could say 90% of the schools in my area had metal detectors on police. And these schools,
You were in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, and these schools were without incident.
Right.
Like there was no cause to it. And, that was one of the first times I heard like the school to prison pipeline. We didn't understand that. But in that school environment, you start to adapt and adopt to that feel of resistance in that setting. So now you have it in the street. Now you have it in an extra controlled setting where you're supposed to learn. And before you could even get to class, you walk through metal detectors, a wand, running your thing. And the communication between that process, which is probably only 3 minutes, the negativity and the tension in that, before you get into class, you're already disturbed. You already feel away. You don't even want to go. You're out of school. So, the in-depth in it, that intensifies the feeling and the mindsets of the psyche. It's very traumatic.
Yeah, people don't get that. It's another one of those things. People don't get that. The ways in which what you just described undermine school climate, right? And so you have well-meaning people, well-meaning teachers, well-meaning school administrators who want their schools to be safe. And so, but they have bought into this false binary that the only way to achieve school safety is through traditional law enforcement methods, and ignoring all the trauma that's associated with that. And again, every time you tell a story, I'm just mesmerized about how contemporary this is, right? So that's your experience when you were in school. I'm telling you, I write in the book, when I went to visit my clients at their schools and experiencing exactly what you're talking about. Like to this day, that's recent. That's in the last 2 and 3 years. I walk into a school in Washington, D.C., and you see the kids getting, yes, the negativity, the tone, the profanity that goes back and forth, just all of it, just to get in the door, right?
And that experience, after actually experiencing incarceration, the feel was equal.
Yes.
That experience that I got going into school, down to the colors of this school, was parallel to my experience of incarceration.
That's that's no joke. So what's the way to interrupt it? I don't know. If
Yeah,
it's
no, I mean,
even a question.
it is the question, right? Like, how do we move our way through it? So I think there are several things, and one on that school front, like there are some concrete strategies, right? One, we've really got to shift the narrative. There are several narratives that need to be shifted. One of the shifts is the one that we're talking about, that Black children are children too, right? Really getting folks to get proximate with Black youth with an open mind and an honesty of acknowledging their own biases about Black children to really begin to undo some of that false narrative. That's the hard work, right?
So let me
hard.
interrupt
That's hard.
really quickly again, just to do the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But there are Black kids who are out there doing things they shouldn't be doing. And this is just one step to addressing some real issues.
So here's the deal, right? One, I want to do some myth busting, right? Which is, it is absolutely true that there are some Black children out there doing some really horrible things. Well, guess what? So are there some white children out there doing some really horrible things. So that's one myth, that there isn't the difference that we think there is. Here's another myth buster, is that whenever I talk about incarceration or children being, even transferred up to adult court or being in the youth legal system, people assume that I am talking about serious violent offenses, those offenses that we are most afraid of, that, rape, murder, aggravated assault, things of that nature. The reality is the very few children, very few teenagers of any race commit the types of crimes that we're most afraid of in society, right? Statistics show, the latest, statistics always lag. The most recent national statistic shows that even of arrest rates, only 9% of all arrests involving Black youth involve that type of serious violent offense that we're talking about, right? So looking at the system as a whole, 80% or more of children who are in the juvenile legal system are in there for low-level, non-violent offenses, all right? So when we talk about, we're responding to or reacting to, children who commit very serious crimes, that's a media flaw. That is a narrative flaw, right? That what's happening in the system is a response to that. If that's what we were talking about, then I wouldn't have written the book. Okay, that if our juvenile legal system was small and narrow to address that population, that's a different question. That's not what we're talking about. That's one thing, right? And then the other half of it is your story, right? So it's or not even your story. You're saying you were in and for something you didn't do. Think about the kids who actually get in the system for something that they did do. We seem to figure out a way to find those rehabilitative alternatives to severe sentences, lengthy juvenile life without parole, right? And so even if it's true that we are responding to high profile, serious incidents, how are we responding to them, right? And so think about, again, the book is, I try to tell stories as well as these narratives, but think about the white children that you've heard about, Ethan Couch, right? Y'all remember him? That story, the affluenza defense, all right? Okay, good. I'm glad some of the young people are nodding. I'm like, how old am I? No, but right? But right.
Say it.
Yeah, I won't tell the story.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But no. But this is the kid, right? Who is, grew up wealthy, is privileged. His parents give him everything in the world. And so one day he decides, like any other teenager, that he wants to have a party when his parents are home, right? So what does he do? He borrows, they give him permission though, right? Parents give him permission to have this party. He gets in a truck with all his friends, drives to Walmart, buys some beer, they're completely drunk, and he runs a group of people off the road, killing, I think he killed like 4 and injured 9 other, or maybe there were 9 total, but like 4 people get killed, right? Literally, he gets a rehabilitation center paid for by his parents, right? Absolutely ridiculous. And actually, look, I can go on and on with anecdotes, but there are so many stories that we know of. Y'all remember the Splenda man, the girls who stabbed their friend in the woods, the Slender man, the case, right? That's another example. They immediately identified them as mentally ill. I support that. But so many of the children of color who come through the system don't get identified as mentally ill. They get identified as what? Antisocial, right? Violent, terrorist, and immediately transferred, to adult court, things of that nature. So my point is, I just push back on that. It's absolutely the question I get all the time. We're not talking about most of the time when we're not talking about these violent offenses. And even when we are, let's figure out what to do that makes sense.
And this is part of that pretense that I was talking about
Yes.
earlier, because we're feeding narratives about a kind of inherent Black pathology,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
you have to start with kids,
Yeah.
because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Like
Right.
it's suddenly at 21, everybody's just killing people and doing everything terrible. That doesn't make sense, right? So you have to create a whole story about what Black kids are doing from day one. And you lay this out very clearly, like white kids are doing the same thing. And in fact, most Black kids are doing weed, right?
Right.
But white kids are doing all sorts of drugs, all sorts of
Absolutely.
prescription things. And that was interesting to me too, because there's layers about class,
Yep.
there's layers about space,
Yep.
and who goes where to do what.
Absolutely.
Right. And so all of these questions, it's tangled and it's very thorny, but it always falls out on these same lines.
The same narrative, same pretenses. I love your word. Yeah.
So just said that, now I'm like, where were we?
Well, what some of the solutions were,
Oh, yes.
right? So I started with the cultural narrative shift, which is the hardest part, and I'm glad you pushed back, right? So it's the narrative shift that we have to do. But then, at each of these points, right? I think, and it's going to take a lot of work, a multifaceted strategy, right? That is integrated, and no one thing is going to work, but like just taking one isolated piece, the schools, right? Like what can we do in the school context? First of all, we've got to radically reduce the footprint of police officers in the lives of children, period, and particularly Black and brown children who are disproportionately targeted. And so in the school system, that looks like police-free schools, right? And so when I say police-free schools, it's not as radical as people, again, you notice I keep saying that. None of this is as radical as people act like it is when they want to push back on these arguments, right? It really isn't as radical as it sounds. Really what we're saying is that we want to be more nuanced in thinking about what do we really need police officers for in this country, right? And then relieving officers of all of those duties and responsibilities, one, that they really don't want, okay? And that they're not trained or well-suited to handle.
Mhm.
And that includes things like regulating adolescent behavior, right? They're not trained for that. Very few police departments in the country, one data point said less than 2% of police departments across the country have any adequate training around adolescent development. They are not equipped to de-escalate or to handle, special education or mental illness, any of that stuff, right? So they're not, equipped. So what it means to, this police-free schools is not an abolition. It just means let's figure out what we need them for. We need them to intervene on serious violent offenses. And guess what? Police-free schools doesn't mean that police can't be called. We still have 911, right? And how close are schools, our police departments to public schools? They're down the road, right? So they can get there, right? The problem with having police physically present, it becomes the default. And that, teachers, naturally just, I need to teach my class, so let me get the police officer to handle that, right? So it's that over-reliance. And so, the short answer is we need a public health approach.
Yes.
Right, to both community safety and to school safety. And that means, a public health approach is attentive to relationships between adults and children. A public health approach is racially equitable, right? A public health approach also is restorative, seeks to restore people and communities after conflict, right? And it's also trauma-informed. All the trauma. And so not only just the trauma that so many Black and brown folks face in their communities, but then the additional trauma that is imposed from racism, right? And racial bias in society. So
Yeah, most definitely.
yeah.
And the mental health aspects and the acknowledgement of the effects of that on both ends, I think is another good way to start the change and the dialogue of it. Because just like many in this room, the in-depth effects of this probably are not known because the situations or the places that they live that they don't face, and it's not faced on for them to understand it. So even that dialogue, to have that in place, to get the true depth and understanding of what is faced is very important, that conversation, because a lot of people really don't know. It's a day-to-day when I walk out my door. it's like I have a checklist.
Yeah.
I got 2 IDs, I got 1 in the car. It's a checklist for me, you know, it's a checklist when I get pulled over, windows down, lights on, hand in the steering wheel, make sure radio's off. I don't care if it's snowing, raining, this is a checklist for me. The realism of that and the acknowledgement and the dialogue of that, so that it's more known, is very important as well.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I gotta say, even, again, you're doing it again. You're telling these stories that we've got to educate folks, because so many people don't know that reality. And I'll even confess that me, as a defense attorney, right? I've been a defense attorney for 26 years, okay? Going out into communities. But you notice what I already said, going out into communities, right? So as a law professor, I already have a privilege, right? A privilege from the space in which I work, a privilege from my community. So when I get up in the morning, I don't experience that, right? As a Black woman. Now, of course, there are places where I go unequivocally, where I get it. So I get it on some level, but to get it on your level, that's the education that needs to be done. And so even, and I just say that, you know, writing this book for me was at times very, very painful, because you do the work for so long and you know how, you know, traumatic it is. And I knew that police officers were in my clients' communities every day, all day long, because whenever I go to visit, they were there. But to really stop and internalize that and to own that, it's when I started writing the book. And I realized that I would literally cry, like retelling these stories. And I'm like, wow, if I'm experiencing this level of secondary trauma in the retelling of those stories, imagine how my clients were. And so for me, even having done it for 26 years, it was still a wake-up call. And so I think this point that you're making about people got to know, and you got to know it not just as an intellectual experience, right? But in like, what is it like to get up and have to check and make sure you have 2, 3 IDs so that you can go out in case I get stopped? What am I going to do, right? It's deep.
It is.
And it's also just the loss, I think, as a attorney who, you know, represents people in these cases, you just see how much is being shunted into this system and then dissipating.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had a client at the Innocence Project named Reginald Early, and when he was 16, he, you know, brutally murdered and raped an elderly woman who was dying of cancer. Like, the facts could not have been worse.
Yeah.
And he wrote the Innocence Project on behalf of himself and 3 other co-defendants. And he later wrote me to say, look, I did this, but none of these other people did it.
Mm-hmm.
But the other people, one of them had mental health issues. He had a very low IQ, and he was coerced into saying that he was involved, right? And so what happened is that this young man who was actually struggling with his own issues and acted out in the worst way possible, got these other 3 people eventually out of prison by attesting to those things. But he's also an incredibly intelligent, brilliant man. And all of that stuff was stunted from this childhood of constant surveillance and being told that he was unworthy of anything, right? And I'm not in any way excusing him, and he would not excuse him, but we have really deep problems about what we are doing to a significant chunk of this population.
Absolutely.
And that is a loss for the country.
It is.
It's, you know, these are brilliant people
Oh, yeah.
who are not being given the mental space to even own what they're capable of.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's so true. I mean, like some of the, I can, you know, again, I have to be careful not to say their real names, but you know, my kid, Kevin, who I represented 3 years, one of the, you know, smart, so many of my clients, just, you know, brilliant. Like if they had just been given that opportunity, that's the thing.
Even a person who was incarcerated, whether they did it or not, and coming out, I could, in my experience, when I was released after 13 years, and I had no work history. I went in as a kid, I came over as an adult. And I remember in parole, they did a kind of like assembly to announce their new procedures. They're not going to be so strict on the restrictions. And so anybody here was sentenced to life. And I raised my hand, and he verbally said, okay, you ruined yours. Just have it go to the side. This is for everybody else. Wow. And I remember asking to speak to the supervisor. And his name was Mr. Flanagan. He said to me, you made your 3rd mark. He said, you're young, Black, and a felon. And even with all my experiences, even with that, I was counted out even further. And, right now I help a lot of brothers in their transitions getting out with my nonprofit. And it's realized how much that trauma gets amplified with those cases or ones who get out, who are now faced with that fall deeper into those actions. And then they do what they know to do, what they are restricted to do. I could have easily been the same.
Can you tell us a little bit about your not-for-profit?
My not-for-profit is called Spud Inc. Some people understand differently. And my whole thing with some people that understand differently is we try to use a different approach to decision-making. We use music in the arts. I love music. Music was one of the things that actually kept me sane while incarcerated. So what we do is we bring the arts to the schools and we teach the youth or young adults how recording is parallel to life. We make sound parallel to anger. And we show them how to channel their anger using the amplifiers of a recording studio. Because our theory is anger is neither negative or positive. It's the actions of its usage. Anger is one of the most powerful energies in the world. It'll have you slam your favorite cup and be mad about it. But if you channel that anger properly, you can get better results. And that's what we do. I was even going back to the prison that I was actually in to run this program because they said they couldn't communicate with the brothers that were there. And it was an honor. People called me crazy, but I understood. And because my experiences and I was able to proceed in a better light out here, I wanted to give those brothers that same opportunity because it's on us. So that's what I do with the nonprofit. We also have a center in East New York where we open up the center to the community, and we offer the program for free.
So on that note, why the rage of innocence?
So, of course, it's the words themselves are a play on the book, The Age of Innocence, and, the ways in which society tried to force people into traditional norms. But for me, the rage of innocence is the rage that all of us, every single one of us should have anytime we deprive any one child of an opportunity to be a child, right? So that's the meta level. But at a more nuanced level, it's what we've been talking about, right? It is the rage that Black children have when you tell them over and over and over and over again that they're bad, that they're criminal, and they're not worth anything. And I already said, it doesn't look like that reasoned, articulate response. It looks like adolescent impulsivity or emotional flavor. And so that's really where the title comes from and what it means.
So what would you say to new public defenders, junior attorneys who are stepping into this world and into this particular representation of younger Black clients?
Yeah, it's probably a summary of a lot of what we've already talked about. So one is the point that you made, Eric, about education, right? And so shockingly, like I even said it for myself, like it's what I actually recently, just last week, was giving a talk to some public defenders, and I said this, it's understanding our clients at a deeper level than we even thought, right? And that includes this trauma piece, like really understanding, not just from, an academic legal mind, what it must be like, to be a Black, boy in America or a Black girl in America, but really trying to get close and understand what that is. Asking a different set of questions, reading, about trauma and what it means. So I think that's one thing, it's relating to our clients differently. I also think it is about courage, right? It's about the courage to name race when we see it. And so I often, do workshops called see something, say something, right? And so that we as lawyers have to learn to litigate some of these questions around race. So we talked about the reasonable Black child and flight and seizure and, consent to search, being able to name, the ways in which race impacts that. And even when it's hard, even when you get pushback from judges who say, I don't want to hear that, right? But it's critical that we do that in the work that we do. And then, I say, look, slowly we make movement, right? Slowly we make change. And we've seen it in some states, Commonwealth versus Warren.
Well,
Yeah.
where would that happen? Like in a brief, in an oral
Oh,
argument? And where would you say that intervention?
First of all, it's everywhere. So one, it's absolutely in the oral argument at the detention, like the first time you get to stand up and, in my jurisdiction, the first place I would get to make that argument. First of all, let's back up. It's in the client interview. It's at every single stage. So when I do sort of workshops around this, at every single stage of the case, from the client interview, the different questions that I ask. But when I get into the courtroom, I'm going to argue the ways in which race impacts the detention question, pretrial detention, risk of flight and danger to the community, trying to undermine, do some of that myth busting, that narrative shifting, that my client isn't a threat and a danger to society. And that even if he ran at the time of arrest, that running at the time of arrest has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not he is a reliable candidate to come back to court at some future date. They're just not the same question. So from there, then it's the pleadings, right? My motion to suppress evidence, whether it's the statement or the tangible evidence, it's going to include race, right? My sentencing arguments are going to include race. My trial theories, right? About, this is law school, so I can say the word mens rea, right? Whether or not my client had the right state of mind in, let's say, in a threats case or an assault on a police officer case or in a resisting arrest case. Like, does race matter in each of those contexts? And the answer is absolutely yes. So that's one way. It's at every single stage of a criminal or a juvenile legal case, we're raising race. And I know it's hard, right? So I think those are two ways, right? Understanding our clients differently, having the courage to name race.
And recognizing that we are 250 plus years into this, and it took 250 plus years to get where we are.
Yeah.
And so your one moment in your oral argument is not going to shift the entire.
Absolutely
So,
not. Exactly.
mhm.
And so then look, I'm looking at a room full of future judges, future legislators, lawmakers, prosecutors, absolutely. I say all the time, prosecutors, and I said in the book, prosecutors are the gatekeepers, right, of juvenile and criminal court, and may easily be the most powerful player in the system, right? So whatever role you all are going to assume in the system, you have a part to play. Right. And even if you decide not to do law, right, and you go and you do something else, every single one of us has a role to play in this